Now animals really do that with smell, right? Because your typical animal is a smell-based creature, whereas human beings aren't really so much that, probably because we became upright and for a bunch of other reasons. But smell is a tremendously powerful modality, and it's pretty much fully there at birth as well. And mothers report that they can distinguish their baby by smell virtually, a day or two after they're born. They know the smell. And babies can certainly smell their mothers and their fathers as well. It doesn't take very long at all. So anyways, the baby's got its mouth, and so it can start getting somewhere with that. And then it's also got basic reflexes, And now what a baby does in some sense is it starts developing from the middle and the top downward and outward. So the mouth and the nose are all wired up. The eyes start to get wired up fairly quickly. They're not much to begin with because a baby will move its eyes independently. And it's not very good at focusing, although its focal length is actually, its natural focal length is pretty much exactly the distance from breast to mother's eye, which makes perfect sense, right? Because the baby wants to be able to communicate extraordinarily well to produce a bond with the mother, and that happens most frequently during breastfeeding, which is also extremely good for the baby because the baby gets touched, and babies really, 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 really need to be touched. If you don't touch them, they die. So even if you feed them and shelter them and all those sorts of things, they have to be touched, and it's very good for the baby's development. So anyways, the baby starts out with its ability to explore with its mouth and its tongue and its ability to smell, and then it starts to develop its eyes, but it does that in concert with developing other parts of its body, and so the baby, if you put the baby on its stomach, then it starts to exercise its ability to lift up its head, and so it kind of gets that going, and it starts to learn how to use its arms and its legs, and so one thing you can do for a baby, for example, to help it get going, so let's say the baby's in its crib. It's laying face upward. Okay, you can give it a mobile. Now, if you go into a baby store and you look at mobiles, what you'll see is maybe the top part is like two coat hangers, right? It's like a cross. And then there's things hanging from it. And the things will be, I don't know, maybe they're cute, who knows, Hello Kitty things or some damn thing like that. And they're facing you. Well, that's a stupid mobile. Because you aren't the person who's supposed to be looking at the Hello Kitty things. The baby's supposed to be looking at it, so those should be facing down. And they never are. They're always facing sideways, so when the baby looks up, all it sees is a bunch of horizontal lines. So let's assume that you're reasonably bright, and you get one that the baby can see, and then maybe it should be black and white, or at least really, really bright primary colors, because it's easier for a baby to detect that. Black and white's really good, because baby's pretty good at detecting edges. And so that thing will move around. The baby will lay there and watch it, and babies, I think, they kind of look like they're stoned on LSD all the time, And I actually think that's technically correct, because one of the things that hallucinogens do is reduce the inhibiting power of memory on perception. And of course, babies have no inhibiting power of memory on perception because they have no memory. So they're pretty much, completely overwhelmed by the world all the time. So they're laying there watching this mobile, and you can shake it, and maybe they'll have a little reflex at that, or you can interact with it in some way, and the baby will start checking that out, and it'll watch it and watch it and watch it, and it'll watch partly so that it can get its eyes organized, and it does that in concert to some degree with its motor ability, because you might say, imagine you're cross-eyed a little bit, like a baby, and you're looking at that thing, and there's two of them, and you might think, well, how do you know there's not two of them? And the answer to that is, well, you have to whack it with your hand. As soon as you whack it with your hand, you're going to find out if it's one thing or two things, once you figure out whether that's one arm or two arms, And so the baby is starting to whack itself against the world and watch the consequences to help it start to build up its ability to interact with the world and its ability to model the world. And so one of the things you'll watch, for example, if you put a baby in a crib and it's got a mobile there, you want to kind of move the mobile down so that it's close enough so that the baby might be able to bump it. Because babies, if you don't swaddle them, they lay there and their hands and legs sort of float in space like this. And it's because they're not really very well connected to them. And that's why a baby will poke itself in the eye now and then with its thumb. And it's rather amusing to watch in a kind of bleak manner. So a baby will lay there and it'll poke itself and it'll go like that. And what it's just discovered is that there's some relationship between that random movement and that sensation. Okay, now, so let's say it's laying there and it's floating around in space, and it's fortunate enough so that its leg comes into contact with an element of the mobile. Well, that'll make the mobile do something interesting and novel. And when the mobile does something interesting and novel, that triggers a reflex in the baby, and the reflex is that the baby will orient towards it and look. And so for Piaget, that was the circuit that was the beginning of the baby's ability to sort of start bootstrapping it up in the world. And he thought what you needed was the ability to move a little bit at least. So that'd be the reflex, say, or even randomness. And then you needed the ability to refine that movement, so that you needed to be able to practice it, and you needed to be able to improve with practice, and you needed to be able to imitate. And one of the things that Piaget thought, which I think is so smart, it's so smart, is that a lot of what babies did was imitate themselves. So, for example, maybe they're laying in bed and they're starting to get some sense of the connection of how their arms and legs work, and so they can maybe start to make sort of broad gestures, and that's it. But now and then they're lucky and they're sort of flinging their arms around and they hit the mobile and they get a little reflex out of that. That's a startle and an indication of interest. And then they'll sit there and practice how to whack that thing with their hand. And so then what they're doing is they kind of accidentally produced a phenomena of interest, and they noted the consequence, and then what they do is try to reduplicate the phenomena of interest. So basically what they're doing is manifesting different patterns of quasi-voluntary reflexive behavior, and then if that produces something of note, they'll practice imitating it. So when my daughter was about 18 months, maybe not even that old, 13, 14 months maybe, old enough to sit up anyways, and old enough to start to do some things by herself, we bought her these books. They were Disney books, hardcover, cardboard books, 5 pages long or something. Each of the pages was quite thick because it was made out of cardboard, and 4 of them would come in a little box, which is about 4 inches high and about 1.5 inches wide. And if you were really careful, you could take out the books, and then you could put all of them back in. It wasn't that easy, because the first one wasn't too hard, but they got consistently more difficult as you kept putting each of them in, because the parameters of the exercise changed. And she must have spent, 150 hours dumping those out, picking them up, putting them in. And you might say, well, what was she doing? And you'd say, well, she was putting books in a box. That's not what she was doing. First of all, they weren't books to her, and it wasn't a box, because she didn't know what a box was. What she was doing was practicing going like this, and matching the size of something to the size of something else. And that's very complicated. And maybe, so there's a jar of apple juice. Okay, so you might say, well, pick that up. Okay, well, you can pick it up like this. 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 Like, there's a lot of things to practice, and each of those movements is a different sensory motor capacity that has an incredibly wide range of potential applications. So a child will sit there and fiddle about with their hands and their arms and the rest of their body for untold hours, because what they're doing is building up these basic sensory motor systems from the bottom up, so that they can, so they practice them in one domain where there's some challenge, and then they're starting to build new exploratory tools that they can go out and practice on the rest of the world. So, once you can grip, once you can grip a mobile, and you can let go, which is something babies actually have a hard time doing, because they have a grip reflex, and they're quite strong when they're first born. If you put your fingers in their hands, you can lift them right off the ground. They'll cling to you, and that's probably old chimpanzee gripping behavior, because chimps grab to their mother's fur, and then they're carried around like that for about 3 years. Now, since you don't have much fur, it's kind of useless for the baby, although they're pretty good at getting your hair and your glasses and your nose, and so And you got to get them to let go. So anyways, they'll sit there and practice all these little subroutines. And so you'll see this too if you have a baby. You've got your baby in the high chair, maybe it's 9 months old, and you're trying to feed the baby, which is often very challenging because babies are very curious and annoying and troublesome and tough and ornery and exploratory and misbehaving and provocative and all those things because they need that to learn about the world. And they'll do something, like maybe they'll eat and they'll drop the spoon and a mess will go on the floor. And they think, well, gravity, that's interesting. So then you'll give them their spoon again, and the first thing they'll do is take their food and fling it on the floor. And then they'll do that lots because they're kind of interested in this whole twisting the spoon and having things fall on the floor phenomena. And so it's part of the reason why it's often hard to feed babies is because even if they're hungry, you feed them 3 things and then they're not starving and then they're so hyper curious that they're going to, try to do something else. So, but what they're doing is they're continually utilizing their basic reflexive behavior and building more and more complex structures up on the basis of that. And with each time they do that, it opens up a new toolbox for them and they, expand outward and start to interact with the world.